Well, time for another silver update with some MACDs. And, we got to look at the charts a little bit later, but I got to talk about silver first. It looks like things have been going upward for the last several weeks, very, very slowly. It's like stair stepping up, getting up in that 28 range. Whippy, right? I'll be more excited when it gets up in the $60 range, or at least 50. But the subject actually is getting kind of boring in my mind, and but I want to talk about something else with these conspiracies. First off, there is conspiracy to actually hold down the price of silver and gold for an obvious reason. The powers that they call them the powers that be, like SGD Bull calls them, whatever the hell. Well, actually, the fiat money power, the guys that put that together, that little racket together, basically where all money comes in the form of a loan and you pay interest on a loan. They don't want people losing faith in the currency, so you got to hold down the price of silver and gold. Ergo, also, it's a very much fundamental principle that the market's going to rule. And, that's really got to get back to the market. This is something Bob Chapman used to say, and he was right about this stuff, this part. Basically, they can only hold it down so long, You heard that crap before. But I got to state this, that, people are getting too focused in on this garbage about, Bill Murphy says this, and, I'm not saying it's not true or not, but you really can't confirm anything too well. But that's not the point. The point is, I believe that there is a conspiracy, more or less, to hold down the price of silver and gold. And the obvious reason is the people controlling the fiat money system, where everything comes in the form of a loan. That's how money comes into being, with interest. They got a reason to hold down silver and gold, so people don't go run into that and they get out of the fiat money. People would see the obvious. So, I mean, that's true. There is kind of, but the thing is, as far as all the little giddy rumors going back and forth about it, what the hell good does that do anybody? It's like, oh, they did this, oh, they did that. It's a bunch of freaking drama left and right. Really, the only thing you got to know is silver's cheap enough right now. If you don't have any, keep buying it. If you got plenty, you don't really need to be buying more, because, you don't know how long it's going to take for the things to change. But I have to state that, I think there's a number of things coming up with the euro that's going to actually change things around. The only option they got, basically, is to print money. I know you heard that crap a million times, but what they're going to do is they're going to purchase, the Spanish and Italian bonds, lower their short-term debt costs and stuff like that. And, there's going to be more controls. I know Lindsey Williams talked about, when the euro falls, you got 3 weeks to get out of everything paper. I don't know if the euro is going to fall right away. And here's the other beef I have with that, because what would you trade your silver for? The New World Order currency? Come on, It's I don't think things are actually going to just disappear overnight. In this big cataclysmic bomb or something, financial bomb or whatever the hell you want to call it. That is like a little bit too crazy for me to fathom. And I don't think you're going to be able to use silver and gold to actually exchange for goods in the near term future, like walking into a Walmart or going to a gas station and picking up gas with silver or something like that. I don't think that situation is going to come about right away. So but I do think the price is going to escalate quite a bit. There's going to be more or less the controlled collapse. That's the way I see it. Now, if you're looking at this silver chart, the weekly chart, things have been stair-stepping up for the last several weeks, so that's a bright spot. Now, in September, a lot of people are kind of arguing one way or the other. Like, there's a lot of different things coming up with the euro. They're going to have to iron out a lot of things with different agreements. There's going to be a showdown between Germany and Italy and all this type of stuff. Some people are predicting that silver's going to crash at that time. It might have a little bit of a market correction, but it's not even going to reach 20 or 22. Let alone 18 or 15. It's not going to get down that low. And I think there is a market correction coming up, and that's probably going to affect the silver market too. But I think there is a market correction coming up. I know Mark Farber says this, but I was kind of looking at things. My own little head was saying, I don't think our economy is doing so good. You know, pointing out the garbage index and the PMI is down and all this garbage. But, you know, a 10% correction in the actual equities markets, you know, the S&P goes down 150 points around there roughly, Ben Bernanke's going to act. And that's a simple thing. It's going to act. Now, you know, here's the other side of the equation too, or another point to consider. You know, sometimes when they talk about QE, they're going to bring out the big bazooka, you know, all this kind of garbage. You know, it's not always how big the gun is, you know, the QE gun is or the bazooka is. It's how many rounds you fire. So right now, Bernd Bernanke is probably doing like a stealth QE. We talked about just a few weeks ago. He did 600 million of repurchase agreements of securities. And that was like a little micro mini QE, although he wasn't calling it that. He was calling it like a test of the readiness that he can react to any financial crisis if need be. But, you know, in fact, it was a little bit of a QE. People really knew what it was. So he's doing stuff. And you got to remember, he doesn't have to make this big proclamation like, I am doing QE3. He could fire a number of little rounds, and that's what I think is going to happen. And I think Mario Draghi on the other side of the Atlantic is going to be doing that too. They're going to shore up the Spanish bonds. They're going to help them in Italian bonds. They're going to repurchase their short-term debt. They're going to keep the rates low. That's going to keep the governments floating. Now, when they do that, basically they're printing money. So there's only one direction for real hard assets to go, and that's up. That's up. Now, one other thing, you know, we talked about oil a little bit. Oil's been creeping up too, but you know, everything's been creeping up. So that's telling me the fiat money is going down. It's going down. I mean, what the hell can I tell you, right? It's going down. So, I mean, you're looking at basically every like you got to look at it this way. Real hard assets really is, you know, that people consume, which could be silver, could be copper, could be lead. You know, aluminum's probably not going to be doing so good because that's very abundant. But crude oil, another good indication. Crude oil actually is a very good indication of how much inflation's going on in a way too, because it does, you know, it's does pretty much link up with gold, but basically crude oil, crude oil is going up. It's kind of telling you that's a price increase across the board in pretty much everything, because everything's transported and pretty much everything uses energy to be produced or grown or manufactured or whatever. So, you know, even crude oil itself is enough of an indication of inflation, and probably that's what we're seeing here, more inflationary pressures than you know, the Iranian story, which has been getting so burned out on people, you know, one way or the other. Is the war going to start? Is it not going to start? You know, they're going to close the Straits of Hormuz? No, they're not. I think it's more of inflationary pressures that are bringing up the price of oil right now. Now, what could actually be a major game changer, and I talked about this before, is a war with Iran. Will that happen before the election? Some people are saying yes. And, you know, the reason is because their fear of a second term Obama coming into play where he would not be cooperative with Israel in doing an attack, because basically he'd be in his second term and he could do what he wants. So, I don't know. It really is anybody's guess, because it could have happened already and no expert even knows, because there's too many factors involved. Even the best minds don't know when it's going to happen. But we can pretty much tell that it's going to happen fairly soon. And when it does, gold, oil, and silver is going to fly. So that's another bullish sign that's out there. Now, I want to talk about one other thing. Guns. Guns. Now, I know people are into silver. Some of them are like real, I don't know, total, maybe they're anti-gun or something. But I got to point this out, you know. When I was on my motorcycle, for instance, I always used to realize that at any point in time, I always had guns. I realized that, you know, when I was on my motorcycle, at any point in time, somebody can kill me with their car, you know, but they don't. And that's just the way I look. That's just how I put that mentality towards guns. In other words, Just because you have a gun doesn't mean you're going to use it. Just because you have a kitchen knife doesn't mean you're going to use it. Just because you have a car and I have a motorcycle, doesn't mean you're necessarily going to kill me because I'm not driving a car at the time. So, it's if you got to examine human nature, and I would recommend that you do get a gun and you actually get 1,000 rounds of ammunition. I would if you don't have. Talking about silver, talking about gold, talking about platinum and palladium. If you don't have a gun, you should get that. And I think a lot of people probably are in that camp already. Now, I want to talk a little bit about something because I go back a ways, and I know I study, even though I'm not like really, really old, I can remember the 60s very well, and I'm pretty well educated. I was actually a very high grade student, and I was very up on current affairs, what happened in the news, even when I was like 15, 16 years old and younger. And so even I remember things that were going on very well back in the 60s, because I was a little bit more brighter than my years at the time, too. So what I could say is that, I remember a lot of times they talked about the communist conspiracy, the communist bloc nations, and they had this big thing between the East and the West. But, some of the more smarter people always pointed out, if it wasn't for the economic powerhouse engine of the Western economies, that the whole communist bloc would collapse overnight, because basically it's being funded by big money in stealth ways through, land lease and all this type of stuff. A lot of the economies that were, a lot of times Russia was supported basically by the United States. Even in the 30s, they gave, Franklin Delano Roosevelt gave, I don't know if it was him or the Secretary of the Treasury, gave Russia like $100 printing plates to print money to help build up their military, at that time. And this is before they even knew anything was going on with the Nazis and stuff, the way, big threat and all this garbage. I mean, this is back in the early 30s. So basically, communism was always supported by the economic financial powerhouse of the West. In other words, if we go to a global communist system, my point is this: it's going to fall apart. It's going to fall apart by itself. It may be pretty damn ugly while it's falling apart, but it ain't going to last. So, if the situation, and actually I see this kind of moving this way. I've seen it moving this way for about, decades, so I don't want people to freak out about it. Don't listen to Alex Jones. That guy freaks people out too much. I don't like that guy. I don't want to come from that angle because that guy basically has everybody hitting the panic button all the time. Alex Jones, I don't like that guy. But I have to say that there is this trend and there is this garbage by these globalist, egomaniac shitheads that want to run everybody into the ground and control the earth. I mean, let me put it this way. That's kind of like human nature. There's been people like that around since the Egyptians and the pharaohs were around, But I just got to point out that it's going to fall apart by itself. And one of the things to keep your rights from being violated in a real fashion as a last resort to defend your life is a gun. I mean, nobody's going to get too far out of hand that's in an authoritative position if people have a way to defend themselves. So even though this is a silver update, I got to point out, go with the number one thing you need first, besides food, is a gun. They talk about the silver bullet and all this kind of crap. You really do need a gun first. So, that's one way I kind of disagree with some garbage that's out there on the net. I mean, some people go too crazy on this survivalist crap and everything. They overdo it. And I really do think you just got to keep your little common sense going mostly. You just can't be saying, the sky's falling. And I'm not like real super religious. I'm not like somebody that's sometimes people are worried about, the Revelation says this. Well, it depends on what kind of, if you're in with that Harold Camping guy, you know what I'm talking about, the guy that says the world's going to end, that guy's a racket. He's a racket. You gotta remember this if you really want to be religious in a more normal way. Jesus Christ was a carpenter, right? He made stuff. He built stuff himself, right? So basically, these are the kind of people I respect in the United States more than anybody. Not the Pharisees, not the guys that are out there, the professionals in the suits slinging BS left and right. If you actually are into this Jesus stuff, you ought to be one of the people that do things that actually produce something that actually helps people in a real way. And usually when I'm saying that, it's like skilled labor. So Jesus was a carpenter, and I'll just leave it as that. I know, Jesus, I don't know if he's a pacifist. Well, I don't go and get into all that stuff. I tell you right now, if I was Jesus, and I'm not, and I had a sword, and the Romans were coming out, I would have chopped off some shithead's head that was trying to set me up to put me on a cross with Pontius Pilate, as the stooge that would do it. So I don't know if that's godlike or not, but basically, that's what I would do. So maybe I'm not super religious, but that's what I would do. If somebody want to nail me to the cross, I'd be pulling out the sword and I'd chop him in two, 3 times at least. And that's the way I look at it. So I don't know, maybe I'm not super religious, but I kind of believe that Jesus' message pretty much. It makes a lot of sense. Like I said, Jesus was a carpenter. He wasn't a Pharisee. He wasn't a silver blogger selling snake oil. And he liked Mary